Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome once again to Montgomery County Executives Mark Elridge weekly media briefing and public health update. I'm Lorna Virgilio, Hispanic Public Information Officer for Montgomery County Government, and joining us today is Mr. Sean O'Donnell, who is Program Administrator, Public Health, Emergency Preparedness, and Response for the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as Dr. Earl Stoddard, who is Assistant Chief Administrative Officer. And today we have two special guests, council members, Kristen Mink and Will Jawanda. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And with that, I toss it to you, Mr. County Executive.
So good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us again today. Rent stabilization is something I tried to introduce last summer to fight the tide of rising rent prices in Montgomery County. Frankly, I tried raising it twice when I was on the county council. Park and planning data, I think, gives you the kind of basis to understand what has been happening in Montgomery County. If you go back to the year 2000, the county had about 43,000 naturally occurring affordable housing units. By 2020, that number was reduced to about 22,000, and they're projecting by 2030 we could lose half of that number, bringing us close to 10 or 11,000 remaining naturally occurring affordable housing units. These units didn't disappear, they simply became unaffordable. And unfortunately, last summer, there wasn't enough support on the council to even bring up this issue for a vote. But yesterday, we saw two competing measures introduced to the county council. I want to be clear that I support the measure co-sponsored by council members Jawanda and Mink, one they call the Home Act. It limits rent increases to the county voluntary rent guidelines, or 3%, whichever is lower, but it also allows for these moderate rent adjustments to help landlords keep up with the cost of maintenance, and gives them the opportunity to request exemptions when their costs exceed the guidelines. Passing the Home Act would help limit the number of evictions here in Montgomery County, and since July of 21, we've seen over 3,000 writs. Not all of them have resulted in eviction, but it's created a lot of what you call self-eviction when people realize they're going to go to court and get evicted anyway, and they leave because they can't pay the rent and they know they're going to go to court and leave. And so they make their plans more expeditiously about where to live next. Not always in the county, unfortunately. We had 112 complaints about rent increases between May and January, and they involved about 80 buildings. The average reported rent increase over all reports was almost 22%. But what people need to remember is that most tenants have learned over the years that appealing to the county is futile, because our rent guidelines are voluntary. And over the years, county government has been unable to help them. When you call and get no help, you don't bother to call again. I experienced that as a council member. I experienced it as county executive when people would tell us we're getting these rent increases, you have to stop it, and we're left with saying we have no ability to stop it. These guidelines are voluntary, they're not required. I'd like to welcome council members Jawanda and Mink now to discuss their rent stabilization measure before they take questions about their bill. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to my council friends.
Thank you, County Executive, and good to be here with you and Councilmember Mink and all of our other county government employees that are working to keep everybody safe and expand opportunity here in the county. Really happy that we were able to introduce the Home Act yesterday, which stands for the Housing Opportunity, Mobility, and Equity Act. Worked very hard on this bill. It brings together a lot of ideas. The bills that the county executive mentioned back when he was on the council, a couple of bills that I had introduced, and Councilmember Mink's ideas and thoughts, as well as the community. I think one of the things that's important to point out from the onset, you saw that great picture. Over 40 organizations have supported this bill, our teachers unions, both MCEA and SEIU, because they know how important it is for their workforce to be able to afford to live here, most of whom don't right now. Our McGeo, our county employees, our bus drivers, and all the other service workers throughout our county, and Casa de Maryland and other community groups, broad coalition, and we can provide the list. But this was developed with them, the people who are most impacted. And I think that's really important when you're trying to solve something. As the county executive mentioned, It will cap rents at 3% or the voluntary rent guidelines, which are tied to inflation, whichever is higher or whichever is lower, rather. This is something that follows what Prince George's County, our neighbors, did just last week in capping rents at 3%. So there's a regional important aspect to this. Affordable housing is not a nice to have, it's a necessity. It enables people to thrive and to have consistency and to contribute to our communities. During the pandemic, we were able to pass 2 versions of temporary rent stabilization that I authored. And as I mentioned yesterday, the sky didn't fall. The housing market did not collapse. And you can do both things. You can produce more housing. You can preserve existing affordable. We need to do a better job of that. And you can protect renters and stabilize rents. And we need all of it. I know personally, and you'll hear some more stories of others, but I grew up as a low-income renter in this county in Long Branch and had to move because of cost or because the property wasn't maintained. And that had an impact on my schooling, bouncing around from school to school. And that uncertainty is not only morally wrong, it's not good for our economy, it's not good for our community safety. And it's just not necessary. We don't have to have a community like that. We have 4 of the top 10 most diverse cities in the country: Germantown, Gaithersburg, Rockville, and Silver Spring. If we don't help people stay in their homes and stabilize rents, we won't have that same diverse community. You will have people be forced out of this county, which has already started to happen, but it will happen even more rapidly as the evictions arise and the self-evictions rise. Our Department of Housing and Community Affairs considers 10% to be constructive eviction. I got an email a few weeks ago from a gentleman in Rockville who's paying $2,000, which is middle income, and his rent is going up 10% to $2,200. He can't pay it. He's going to have to move, or he's going to be evicted. And there's nothing we can do right now to help him. And there's nothing worse than feeling like that you can't do something to help him. And that's why this bill needs to pass. It disproportionately impacts our African-American community, our Latino community, our immigrant community. Nearly 60% of Black households rent, double the percentage of white or Asian households. 11% of our renters live in single-family homes. The county executive mentioned that there was another bill introduced yesterday that's 8% plus inflation, which right now would be over 12%. It doesn't even include single-family homes, which are more than 12,000 folks that are renting in single-family homes. It exempts them. We have to make sure we stabilize people in their homes. EHCA reported, the county executive mentioned this, over a 200% increase in complaints about high rents. And that's just the people who are called in. Many don't even bother. So what we are trying to do here is create consistency for landlords. They know what's going to happen, but also most importantly for renters. Just like everyone who has a 30-year mortgage does, you know what it's going to be the next year. You can plan, you can put your expenses in order and have a stable life. Nearly 40% of our county rents, that number continues to rise. These folks, these are their homes. They need this stability. And an increase of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or more percent will not provide it. So we need to have meaningful stabilization. That's what this bill does. And it would also create more affordable housing. It creates a vacancy tax that will then put money into our housing initiative fund, which helps offset and build more affordable housing in the county. It provides landlords a fair return exemption, or they can bank multiple increases over years if they choose. So it creates equity for landlords as well. And it has a 10-year exemption for new construction, meaning you can charge anything you want based on the market in the first year and continue and raise it at whatever levels at the market rate until the 10th year, and then you come into the system. So the idea that this is going to discourage new housing is just false. It's structured in a way that will not allow that to happen. So I really thank Council Member Mink, County Executive, for partnering on this. We can get this done and provide stability to everyone in the community. Turn it over to you, Councilmember Mink.
Thank you, Councilmember Jawando. Thank you, County Executive. Thank you to everyone for being here. I think it's important to put some faces to what we're talking about today. So some of you may know Coach Fofo, or you might remember him from the 2019 news cycle. He's the founder of the Elite Soccer Youth Development Academy, which uses soccer as a vehicle to mentor and guide our young people. And in 2019, the community and the entire county council rose up to prevent Coach Fofo from being deported under Trump's immigration policies. Well, he recently reached out to my office for help because he is facing potential displacement due to an 8% increase in his rent. Quote, he wrote, "I cannot afford to continue to pay because the monthly income I bring into my home is not close to what I pay in rent." And a letter from him is part of the bill packet, which includes a selection of 40 letters that I encourage you to take a good look at. And I want to emphasize that the reason that we wrote the Home Act the way we did is because Coach Fofo's story, including the percent increase that made his housing costs unaffordable, is not unique in Montgomery County. It is representative. Since temporary rent stabilization was lifted last August, evictions have skyrocketed. If we look at our most recent month, February, for which we have data, in February 2022, there were 35 evictions scheduled. Last month, 380. So we absolutely have to pass protections that are going to put the brakes on this crisis. It's escalating. So in crafting the bill, we worked to understand the needs of county employees, teachers, counselors, custodial staff, bus drivers, many of whom cannot afford to live in the county where they work. 3 of the 40 letters of support in the bill packet come from MCEA, SEIU Local 500, and McGeo. We worked with and heard from community organizations who serve renters like CASA and Shepherd's Table and African Communities Together, all of them reporting a landslide of tenants suffering from unaffordable rent increases and a real fear about the lack of relief in sight. And we also worked with policy experts who have crafted successful and court-tested rent stabilization measures, both locally and across the country. So, ultimately, the question that we all need to be wrestling with is what is needed to provide stability in Montgomery County. That has to be our starting point. Nearly half of our county's renters are considered cost burdened, meaning that they are spending 30% or more of their income on housing, and they may have difficulty then paying for food, transportation, and other necessities. Nearly a quarter of our renters spend half of their income or more on housing. And I want to highlight that of those, the income of most of them is 30% or less of our AMI, area median income. So what we see from that is that an enormous and, as Councilmember Jawando mentioned, disproportionately Black and Brown segment of our residents cannot just absorb annual rent increases of 6%, 8%, 10%, and so on. And so we have to acknowledge that for the significant portion of our residents, receiving an increase like that is tantamount to an eviction notice on the door. And so what does living on that tightrope look like? Take Alexis Kurtz, who also has a letter in the packet and wrote, "I'm a public school teacher who's recently experienced a 7% rent increase. I've also faced mold, oil paint melting in the bathroom and dripping down our faces when we shower, and flooding during heavy rain. My rent is nearly 50% of my paycheck, and that's with a roommate. I am lucky enough to be a middle school teacher at a school that gives free breakfast, which I usually eat for lunch. If my rent increases again, I'm going to have to move out of MoCo and get a job somewhere else." Liliana Velasquez, who lives at Georgian Way, wrote, "It is challenging to pay a 5% increase. If rent continues to increase the way that it is, I do not know how we will sustain ourselves. Anytime our wages increase, high rent prices, utilities, and the cost of goods offset it. The situation is such that we are currently looking for another home outside of Montgomery County." So if renters are going to have a chance to get ahead, rent increases cannot be set up to outpace wage increases. If we want to preserve Montgomery County's diversity, we have to set a cap that accounts for the financially tenuous state of thousands of rent-burdened, disproportionately Black and Brown residents. The last letter I'm going to share is from Mary Villa, who I happened to meet after a recent council town hall, which fell on a particularly traumatic evening for her. She wrote, "Dear Kristen, I'm not sure if you remember me. I'm from Honduras and a resident of Wheaton. You helped me find shelter after a town hall a few weeks ago. I cannot describe how much that meant to my beautiful 5-year-old daughter and me. Unfortunately, I am back to being unhoused. As you know, I was evicted from my home 2 weeks ago. I watched as my personal belongings and life were dumped on the street in just under 15 minutes. My 5-year-old girl played innocently in the yard. No words can describe the feeling. The best I can come up with is that I had little value as a human being for the first time. I fell behind on rent after an increase of 6%. So again, a cap that's higher than the rate of wage growth significantly above the rate of inflation does not provide the stability and predictability for renters that we are being asked to deliver, that our community is crying out for, and a high cap also is not necessary. It is possible to set a lower cap while protecting landlords' constitutional and well-deserved right to a fair return on their investment. You can refer to letters in the packet from landlords who also support the Home Act. There is plenty of evidence that rent regulations do not need to have a negative impact on development, that case studies pointing to that or to rising rents following rent stabilization were the result of poorly written policy, loopholes that needed to be closed. And because of that, that is why we reached out to policy experts all across the country, that we looked at those bills to make sure we were identifying those loopholes and fixing them on the front end, unlike those other jurisdictions who then had to go back and find their flaws and fill those. So we filled those from the jump. And we also do have clear and consistent evidence that rent stabilization done right is reliably effective at curbing displacement. So we do have the tools, we have the community mandate, we have an agreement across the council that something needs to be done. So the hope here is that we are really going to do something meaningful. I do want to mention that some of my colleagues, separate from the bill introduced for clarity, it's not in the bill or tied to the bill in any kind of way, but they put forward some budget priorities to increase funding for rental assistance, for affordable housing development, and for home ownership programs. And I think that you'll see those measures receiving strong support during the budget process. And I'll note that the Home Act, as mentioned, includes a measure to raise revenue for affordable housing. And I'll also be introducing a bill shortly, which would fund nearly all of the rental assistance that my colleagues have mentioned that they're hoping to find budget space for. So there certainly is agreement there about that as a priority, and I'm excited to work on those together. And I'll just finally note that if we go too low with this, we can reevaluate and adjust. If we go too high right now, we will displace residents, continue to displace residents, and that cannot be undone. Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you both of the council members, Megan and Yolando. Members of the media, we're going to open up this Q&A portion of the presentation just to talk and address questions regarding rent stabilization. Remember, all the topics and public health update questions afterwards. So any questions right now regarding rent stabilization? Any questions on this topic? Going once? Going twice? No questions on rent stabilization. Okay, well, thank you.
Everyone agrees with us, Lorna.
Thank you to both of you. And we understand that you do need to head out of this media briefing. Thanks for joining us. And now you're free to go. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And a link was just dropped for you all to the bill packet, which again includes those 40 letters. So I encourage you to take a look at that. There's the labor union, community organizations, landlords, and impacted tenants are in there.
Thank you, Councilmember Mick. Thank you, everybody. All right, Mr. County Executive, the rest of the briefing.
Yeah, so I just want to thank the council members for your time today. I want to reiterate something I said the other day, that unless there's a significant compromise between the two rent bills introduced yesterday, there's only one clear choice that makes any sense, and that's the Home Act, and accomplishes many of the goals we're hoping to achieve, while the other plan is basically a license for landlords to price gouge and derive the prices of their units so high that many people won't be able to stay. So I'm hoping that the council can reach some accommodation that makes sense. I think if people would look closer at this bill, they'd realize the bill does protect the landlord's income and protects their ability to protect their historic operating expenses. And there's no need to go to the extreme that the other council members have proposed, which are rent increases that are just out of line with reality and have absolutely no connection to cost increases. That's the part I find most stunning about this. Not even a fig leaf of an effort to say that if a landlord's costs increase, then they should get a rent increase based on that, whatever it is. The idea is just basically you can go up to inflation plus 8%, and whatever that number is fine with us. And it's not fine with me, and it's not fine with a lot of residents in our community. On other notes, I want to share some very exciting news that could help our area be seen as the nation's leader in protecting companies from online threats. On Monday, I joined Maryland's Secretary of Commerce and NIST leaders in signing a new agreement committing the county to the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. And since its launch in 2012, the partnership has helped develop a blueprint for cybersecurity that every business in the nation should be using. As we renew this agreement, NIST leaders are doing more to reach out to small businesses, and U.S. Deputy Secretary of Commerce Don Graves announced the launch of the NIST Small Business Community of Interest Program and Cybersecurity Connections Initiative. Both programs aim to help more small businesses with their cybersecurity plans, and by allowing small business owners here in Montgomery County and nationwide to take advantage of pilot programs and new methods for tightening online security, it will help protect companies from financial ruin. The cybersecurity piece is really important. You know, for a lot of companies, for years, this was something that, you know, was kind of treated as optional. But the days of real threats are upon us, and the damage being done to businesses that aren't adequately protective is real. And I am certain that more companies that never thought they'd have to do it are going to have to start protecting themselves from cyber attacks. Some years ago, I sat in a room surrounded by these giant TV screens that literally displayed cyber attacks being launched around the world. And you could sit back and look at a screen and watch an attack launched from any number of countries, sometimes including the United States, and landing someplace else in the world. These were not pictures of government attacks necessarily, but they just represented attacks coming from, I guess you would call them cyber bandits, who were basically trying to disrupt businesses all over the place. And it's a real threat. And it's frightening to think about how much damage can be done and how much attention is needed to protect us from this kind of threat. These efforts are going to be run out of the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence in Rockville. The county's participation in the partnership will continue to be managed by the Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation. And I'm extremely proud of our work with NIST, and I believe a strong network of businesses protected from cybersecurity threats leads to broader advancement in our economic development goals. Our area is already seen as a leader in the life sciences industry and developing a talent pool for those jobs. And we're doing the same thing in the field of cybersecurity as well. So it's going to be, you know, good for the county from an economic development perspective, but it's going to be necessary for the county and the country that this kind of work get done, and as many businesses as possible are able to take advantage of better cybersecurity protections. I want to just take a moment to mention the efforts to bring the FBI headquarters to Prince George's County. Maryland's robust cybersecurity industry should be a big driver for federal government's decision to relocate a new consolidated FBI headquarters to Maryland. This week, County Council President Devin Glass and I co-authored a letter lending our full support to Prince George's County bid to become the home for FBI's new consolidated headquarters. There are many reasons why Prince George's County remains the best choice for relocation, including transit considerations and a savings of between $250 to $500 million compared to moving the headquarters to Virginia. There are also equity matters to consider. The Biden administration can choose an historically underutilized area like Prince George's County, where the median income of families falls far below against the community it's competing against. Historically, Prince George's County has been used by the federal government to set up warehouses with just minuscule of federal leases for real buildings, real projects headed Prince George's County's way. I stand with Governor Westmore and support equitable regional growth. And a few weeks ago, the governor joined us in North Bethesda and talked about this county's leadership and why this decision from GSA is so important to the region and the state's equity to our transportation and sustainability goals. And I'm joining other leaders from around the state today, reiterating this message now that we're closer to a decision from our federal leaders. On a different note, this week, I, along with every council member, sent a letter to the Maryland General Assembly supporting the Melanie Diaz Sprinklers Save Lives Act, House Bill 1292. The majority of the older unprotected buildings throughout Maryland are in Montgomery County, so this House bill has potential to save lives here as well as elsewhere in the state. This legislation is needed to prevent further tragedies, which would immediately improve the safety of county residents. Plans for this change are already in motion, with the state fire marshal already putting this mandate in place by 2033. If passed, this bill would codify in the law that all high-rise buildings be protected by an automatic sprinkler system after January 1, 2033. In case anybody's wondering why the ramp up is this far in the distance, it has to do with the extraordinary costs that will come with this. Everybody needs to be realistic that we don't want to shut down apartment buildings because they can't afford the cost of renovating the building and putting in sprinklers. Putting in an automated sprinkler system is not cheap. I'm hopeful, and I know others are, that the state will find ways to contribute to making this possible, because it's an enormous load and the landlords have to bear the entire load. It's quite likely you could see rent increases that would further put pressure on folks who cannot afford the rent increases they're facing already. So as we ramp up, we're looking for other things we can do to help make sure our buildings are safer. And I want to thank our state delegates, Lord Charcuti, Emily Shetty, David Moon, Jared Solomon, Janelle Wilkins, and others for their sponsorship of the bill. And I want to thank Councilmember Kate Stewart for leading this effort by our county to support the state measure. I'm also outraged over the reports I'm hearing that the management company of this building is forcing displaced tenants to sign waivers in order to recover their belongings. This is outrageous. These people have been displaced by a fire. They should be able to go into the building and get their belongings. They should not have to sign waivers to appease the management company to get access to the property they own in units they rent. They've still paid the rent on the units. They don't own the units, but they rent the units. They have leases, and they can't live there because of the fire. They should not have to sign a waiver with the company over things that have nothing to do with their belongings being in these apartments. And, we have questions about whether this is legal, and we're advising tenants who have signed or being asked to sign this waiver to seek legal counsel. These tenants have been through enough. They shouldn't be struggling to get their belongings back because the landlord is trying to get a waiver out of them. We'll continue to monitor this situation. I also want to thank all those who stepped up to help these tenants who've been displaced. Over $40,000 has been raised so far for their long-term needs, and more than $7,000 for short-term issues like food and families unable to cook for themselves while staying elsewhere. And lastly, getting to our COVID update, in the COVID news, community level remains low. We're starting to get a better timeline of when federal money will no longer provide some of the assistance that we've gotten used to over the past few years. The latest example is the overflow hospital that was set up with COVID-19 patients in Tacoma Park. This was the old Adventist hospital there, and Adventist says that facility is going to be closed on April 28th. I urge you to remind everyone to continue to stay up to date on your boosters, vaccines, and other protections. Health experts say anyone who hasn't received a booster shot since the new bivalent boosters were introduced in September should get one now. Montgomery County remains committed to being a source for vaccines, boosters, and test kits and masks through the end of the year, end of our fiscal year this summer. And I'd like to turn it over now to our community health team for their report, and then we'll take questions from the media.
Thank you, Mr. County Executive. And so to give you a very brief update on COVID this week, we continue to monitor the global cases of COVID, have not seen substantial spikes across the globe. We have not seen any new variants that are causing concern at this moment. Of course, that can change down the line. Looking across our multi-state region, there has not been much change in the variants we're seeing here. It's still the vast majority of cases are the XBB 1.5. And because we've seen no new variants as part of that, that's why we're seeing receding cases, because we've essentially run through this variant in our community. Our emergency department visits continue to be at a more reasonable level than they were a few months ago, which is good news. This is for all different causes of visits. And again, we continue to track respiratory illness that's occurring at different ages. And we see those have leveled off at a similar rate across all ages at this point. As the county executive mentioned, we've seen our transmission numbers come down to a stable rate. We are cautioning there is a lot of COVID cases that are occurring and transmissions occurring across the community, but they're not causing the significant illness that we saw previously. So there could be some reinfections from this. We're still urging caution around individuals who are at higher risk, those who are elderly, have underlying conditions. As you can see, our hospitalization rates have gone down. As our county executive mentioned, we've been alerted that the Adventist alternate care site will be decommissioned on April 28th. They've already stopped taking new patients in. And so that's the biggest decrease in bed use in our county, is those numbers continue to decrease as they work towards eventually closing that surge hospital. Again, tracking the mortality associated with COVID, it's still a disease that is causing deaths in our community at a much higher rate than other diseases. It's still something that we're concerned about. And again, the populations at the greatest risk are those with the underlying conditions or our seniors. You can see our hospitalization rates again have come down, especially with those who are fully vaccinated. They still remain elevated for those who are unvaccinated, the small percentage in our county who are unvaccinated. And we're seeing the same numbers nationally. Respiratory disease, including COVID, including pneumonia and influenza, that has started to come down significantly, as we've reported in previous weeks. Finally, again, we're still tracking influenza data. We do that kind of throughout the year. We're definitely seeing a much lower number of cases now, and we're still tracking mortality related to influenza. Finally, just to reiterate, we continue to offer a large number of vaccination clinics for people to get their boosters for COVID, as well as to receive testing. We're still distributing rapid test kits. Again, if you're symptomatic with flu-like symptoms, you have a fever, you have a cough or sore throat, please use one of the rapid test kits to determine if that is COVID, in which case we'd ask you to make a few more precautions. But if you have those symptoms, whether it's COVID or not COVID, it could be the flu, it could be one of those other respiratory diseases. Please isolate until your symptoms have resolved. Wear a mask when you're around other people. I think we're all very familiar with that guidance at this point. Those are all the updates that I have, and I'm happy to turn it now over to the rest of our team if there's anything else to add.
Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. Dr. Stoddard, do you have any opening statements?
I don't. Sean, you stop sharing. Okay, we're good to go.
Okay, so I guess we can open it up for the Q&A portion of this presentation. I see that Scott Broom has his hand up. Good afternoon already. Scott, there you go.
Good afternoon. Mr. County Executive is back on the Silver Spring fire issue. We did a lot of reporting on it. We found that Trinity Property Consultants is a subsidiary of a $40 billion real estate holding operation. It's, I think, 3 times the size of your annual county budget, capital and operating. And I just wonder if you could reflect for a moment on the sort of David Goliath appearances here, particularly when they're trying to get individual tenants to sign these waivers to get inside to recover, you know, photographs, personal belongings, hair dryers, who knows?
I think it's outrageous. I mean, it's trying to get people, force people to have to sign a waiver in order to get their own stuff back is totally wrong. And I don't know how they can legally keep people out of their apartments to do that. They've got leases on the property. And it's beyond me, we are asking our attorney, how is this legally possible? We have serious concerns about the legality of this. And we'll continue to try to follow up and find a way to get these people to get access to their building without having to sign a waiver. But, it is David and Goliath, but I will frankly say that's a lot of what the world is in the rental world. You're dealing with, huge companies with massive wealth who have enormous control over people's lives. And they exercise it for their own benefit, and they don't necessarily exercise it with any kind of social conscience. It's a problem. Which unfortunately, you can't legislate social conscience.
So fair for me to report the county is looking into the possibility of protecting these tenants, but there's no legal pathway that you all can see for now. If I can move on, I think Trinity operates at least one other high rise. We also got into the issue of fire codes, and there were no fire code violations, and yet, according to witness accounts and the authorities I talked to, these public space hallways, the only alarming system, smoke detector system in those that's connected to an alarm is actually in the elevator lobby, and it doesn't connect to the main box in the building to set off a general alarm. It merely regulates the elevators during the event of a fire. And I think a lot of people were surprised by that. So Trinity has this other building in North Bethesda. I wonder if the county is perhaps reviewing any of these other properties to see what protections may exist, and even in the absence of the new law, which you mentioned,
yes,
which may not pass, whether or not you might be able to work with Trinity property consultants and other landlords to come up with maybe something that's in excess of the current fire code.
I agree with that. I think we have to look at, and we are going to look at what we can do. I mean, this whole idea of waiting to 2033, on the one hand, it's probably a physical necessity because we'd either shut apartments down or displace tenants massively. But short of doing that, we certainly can think about what we can do in terms of requiring more alarms in a building and things that would not cost nearly as much money to do, but would actually increase public safety. So we will get a review of that. Well, I need to understand at this point what we're allowed to do, outside of what the state, allows the fire marshal to do. Do we have the ability to regulate this to a different degree? And that's one of the questions I'm asking. Is this a place where the county has the authority to act absent any state direction or direction from the state fire marshal? So we will get you an answer to that, and I guarantee you anything we can do, we will try to implement.
Perhaps
Can I make a couple of different, can I add a little bit to that, Scott?
I was about to ask you, just in case you've been over to North.
Yes, there's a few things.
A second look at the North Bethesda property.
Yeah, there's a few things the county is also doing in the interim. So obviously, the fire chief sent a notice out to all fire rescue personnel that they're going to be doing a weekend of public education. We've had now 5 fire-related deaths in Montgomery counties since the first of the year. Most of them are focused in they're in sprinkler buildings or in other structures. They're not necessarily in unsprinkled buildings, other than the one other than Diaz's death. But obviously, we've had a number of instances where people have attempted to fight their own fires, or they delayed calling 911, or they've been unaware that they should close doors as they try and escape so they prevent smoke proliferation throughout the building. So there is an education piece to this beyond what the county executive alluded to, which is the legal piece of this. People need to understand the infrastructure they live in, because they're going to be living in that infrastructure, at least to some degree, for some time while these corrections are made. But obviously, we just need people to understand what they should do, what they shouldn't do, and provide some additional education on that. Furthermore, I think one of the nice things about Delegate Charkoudian's bill is that while the primary thing it does is sets the date certain for 2033, it does also require some additional things for unsprinkled buildings in the interim. So effective July 1, they, for example, have to have fire extinguishers in every unit. They'd have to have working fire alarms in all units. That, it talks about, other measures in buildings that would have to be in place in the interim. Now, as county executive alluded to, we will be looking at other measures to try and further that along, but there are some additional provisions beyond just that 2033 date. And we are also attempting to do education through the fire department beginning this weekend, especially tailored towards these structure fires.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Scott. Members of the media, any more questions for the officials today? I don't see any more questions on the chat. Okay, going once, going twice. No more questions then. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Stay safe, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you all. Bye.